All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Renee Barassa, and I'm the Director of Communications and Education here at the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. You will hear us referred to as ICPRB a lot today. So if you hear ICPRB, that's us. We are excited you've joined us for the webinar, Reconsidering Connectivity, a North Branch Potomac Case Study. It is the last in our 6-part webinar series celebrating our 85th anniversary. You'll see all the other webinars that we've already held. If any of those pique your interest, they are all on our YouTube page. And then this one will also be on our YouTube page probably by this afternoon. Next slide, please. And also, if you would like to continue joining us at webinars, we have several winter salt webinars coming up in January to talk about how to be winter salt smart and reduce our impacts on our waterways when we are taking care of our sidewalks and our driveways. So the one on January 21st is for residents to learn how to be winter salt smart, people that take care of their own homes. And then the event on January 23rd is for HOAs and land manager or property managers and folks like that to learn how that they can reduce their impacts on waterways during the winter. Like I said, you can check out our YouTube page for the recordings of these webinars. And I'll cover just some logistics while folks are still logging in because I see the number is still kind of growing. To prevent any accidental unmutes or videos, you will not have the ability to come off mute or turn on your video during the main part of the presentation. However, once the presentation is over, we will update the settings and you will be able to come off mute and turn on your video to ask a question. We encourage you to join the conversation at that point. If you think of a question during the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll address it at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you via email later today. Funding for this webinar is provided by ICPRB's Clean Water Act Section 106 grant from the EPA. I'm going to pull up a poll now. If you've attended any of our previous webinars, you'll know we've had some interesting polls in the beginning of our event. So while you're answering that, I will introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Mike Selkman. He is the Associate Director of Aquatic Habitats at ICPRB. He is responsible for evaluating and assessing the habitat quality and biological health of communities within Potomac waters. His work coordinates the cooperation of federal, state, academic, and local partners to find and implement solutions to environmental issues. Mike, can you go ahead and go to the next slide? There we go. So that's our speaker, and Michael Nardolilli. Boss Mike is going to give us a little background on North Branch. Okay, and with that,
thank you, Renee. So is the poll still open? Chance for voting before I reveal the response.
I have to say, this is the first one where the correct answer was not the one that was most often chosen. So that's interesting. Go ahead,
right,
Mike.
The correct answer is Luke. We all learned a little bit of something today about the boundary lines between the various states on the Potomac River. So thanks for participating in the poll. So yes, I am Mike Nardolilli. I'm the Executive Director of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. Very pleased that you were able to join us today. So next slide. So the Potomac River watershed is roughly the size of Switzerland. It goes from Gettysburg in the north all the way down to Stanton in the south. On the eastern side, it goes all the way to Point Lookout in Maryland, and on the west, it goes to the boundary stone known as the Fairfax Stone. You'll see there a circle around a portion of the Potomac River itself, which we call the North Branch. That There is a south branch, but today's focus is going to be on the north branch of the Potomac River. As you see there, it also fits in with the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. Uh, about 25% of the fresh water that flows into the Chesapeake Bay comes from the Potomac River. And so it's part of a larger watershed that feeds the Chesapeake Bay. Next slide. So who we are, the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin was approved by Congress in 1940 as an interstate compact for the purpose of regulating and controlling, preventing, or otherwise rendering unobjectionable and harmless the pollution of the waters of said Potomac drainage areas. So that was our focus beginning in 1940. And in 1970, our charter was expanded to include water resources such as the water supply and the nation's capital and related land use. The signatory jurisdictions are Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia, but not the United States. The federal government is not a signatory to our compact. And so we're a little bit different than, say, the Delaware River Basin Commission and the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, in which the federal government is a signatory. So we are a creature of the states, of the 5 states in the basin. Importantly, we have no regulatory authority. So what we have done in the past is to focus on the science and to do studies of the river and to share that information with the policymakers to take actions as needed. Next slide. So we have 4 major focus areas, drinking water and water resources, and that has been an important focus of us for a long time, and it becomes more critical in periods of drought like we're in now. The last 3 years, the Potomac Basin has been in a drought situation. Water quality, to examine the water and to make recommendations about ways to improve water quality. Aquatic life is also a very big focus of what we do. We were involved with the restoration of the shad coming back to the Potomac River in the 1990s and are working now on trying to get mussels upstream to act as natural filters for the waters above dams 4 and 5 on the Potomac. And finally, communication and education. We believe that a really important part of what we do is to tell people about the Potomac River and to get their eyes and ears on the Potomac and to report incidents they see on the Potomac and to take action to improve the quality of the Potomac River and the basin. Next slide. So the North Branch has been a focus of ICPRB from the very beginning, from both a water quality and a water quantity standpoint. So you can see on this timeline here that from 1923 to 1965 or so, we considered the Potomac to be an industrial river. There was, an open sewer really in terms of what was flowing into the Potomac River. And so in 1967, you see that the river was really in bad shape. The North Branch Potomac River, NBRP, PR showed really terrible statistics and really was a slow economic collapse in the region around it. In 1970, Jennings Randolph, which was in a reservoir, was constructed on the Maryland and West Virginia border, and that was really the movement forward from a dead river to a more live river. From 1976 to 1984, Jennings Randolph was completed. Of course, the Clean Water Act was approved in 1972, but the information that we had on the river in those days was still rather poor. And so we were able to recognize that more work needed to be done. There was a cooperative Maryland, West Virginia acid mine drainage agreement to address the lifeless North Branch Potomac River from 1985 to 87. And the really recreation began to take off at that point. Estimated 12,000 anglers, trout stocking begins. recreational paddle sports, the World Championship whitewater in 1989. And so that was really the beginning of the recovery of the river. Next slide. And from the standpoint of ICPRB, we were able to see that we have moved from a dead river to a world-class trout fishery. And our vision is contained in a document, Flowing to the Future. So beginning with the Jennings-Randolph Reservoir in 1970, water supply security for the region also created a new economic connection between West Virginia and Maryland, and where ICPRB was the conduit for improved interstate cooperation. We're the coordinating organization for the North Branch Advisory Committee. ICPRB continues to connect regional shareholders with state federal agencies to accomplish a shared vision for the North Branch to the North Branch Vision Plan, which is very similar to a comprehensive plan for the entire basin, but this was the focus of the North Branch. Very pleased now to turn it over to Mike Selkman, who will go into more detail about our North Branch Potomac case study. Mike. I think
Mike,
you're
you might
muted,
be
Mike.
muted. I need to start over.
You're still muted, Mike, I think.
Can you guys unmute me, Renee?
There you go.
Okay. I was
Yep.
I was locked out.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So are we at what are we going to discuss today?
Yep, that's it.
Perfect. So right here in the title, today we're going to talk about reconsidering connectivity, a North Branch Potomac case study. To do that, obviously, we have to start with defining what is connectivity. And then we have to understand place. And I think the North Branch Potomac is a victim of being able to look at a particular time period, and you can make a really good story about any decade, any century. So I think looking at things in the longer term perspective and then kind of seeing how we got to today, I want to kind of play with looking at these time scales. And then ultimately how the development of this region had implications on the in-stream biology. And then at the end of this, I'm going to kind of let the cat out of the bag. I don't have an answer. So in this project, or in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a lot of work that we've done. I want to try and hit home the philosophy behind the work that we're doing. But this shared vision, getting all the stakeholders along the entire basin talking, recognizing what's here, and then kind of converging on what is the future of this just, I mean, it's a ecological success story, but then we can challenge it. Can it be better? What does that look like? So with further ado, I started talking about connectivity over the dinner table, and the kids and the wife were like, internet, Wi-Fi. And, do a quick Google search. There is not much coming up about the environment. Connectivity refers to the degree of direct linkages or interactions between people, places, and regions in a geographic context. It encompasses both physical connections, like transportation and communication networks, as well as social connections. All of us, the love for Instagram and Facebook these days, these social networks, and then cultural exchanges and economic ties. This idea of connectivity is a very anthropogenic one if you start from just what is this thing. And you look at the infrastructure, you talk to people about what is this connectivity, and it's this, it goes to phones. And it occurred to me, phones, streets. You know, I was shocked to find out that this "Can You Hear Me Now" guy is now, those commercials first came out 21 years ago. But looking at these sort of anthropogenic connectivity things, we have the same stuff that we see in nature. We have corridors. Like if we look at the city layout tips off to the right here, there are highways that are these big conduits for movement. And then there are these off ramps, which are smaller tributaries, and those tributaries kind of break up and have these dendritic small feeders that go in, and all along that area, all along that gradient is a continuous change of the biology, the geology. You know, these systems are not isolated benchtop science experiments. There are these connected things. We need to start recognizing the patterns. So I thought it was kind of interesting to start with sort of this, the human view, and when people hear the word, and let's like take the next step. What is ecological connectivity? And the International Union for Conservation of Nature described it as ecological connectivity is the movement of a species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. Ecological connectivity through this means that ecological corridors are critical to the conservation of biodiversity. So again, kind of showing you what I was discussing before, we're talking about a network. And if that's how we need to think about it, this fingering river, this fingered branching river off to the right, is a really good example of how these things sort of break up, and each little bend and each area is its own habitat. Complexity and movement are critical to ecosystem stability. But don't take my word on it. I like the stories of how we got here, the founding fathers of ecology, if you will. And if you have any sort of ecology background, you've probably heard of the Lotka-Volterra equations, the links in the hair. And what was proposed here in 1925 was this idea of dynamic equilibrium. There is an episodic, kind of this oscillation between this boom in predators, a boom in prey, and then a boom in predators, and the prey drops off, and then the predators drop off. And we're not looking at a flat line in any environment. We're actually looking at something that's very dynamic. And with that, as long as this, nature has a heartbeat, as long as things are moving and responding to each other, that is a healthy system. So a lot of folks took this in 1925 and tried to recreate it in a lab setting. They wanted to play with this idea of, can we keep an oscillation going artificially? And it took 30 years before a really successful experiment happened. This is called Huffaker's mites. And on these mites, it's a pretty fun experiment. This is a total snapshot. There were so many different, Huffaker called these his universes. But what he found out was that in simple environments, prey are easily eliminated by the predator, and then the predator eventually starves. So the whole system fails and it collapses. So if you have two oranges and you put on one orange a prey mite and the other orange a predator mite, you put the bridge between them, they will without a doubt collapse. And this is what was happening when folks were looking at simple systems on bench tops. But when you added complexity, when you added everything from Vaseline to keep predators off of some oranges, you added ability for the prey mites to jump off of sticks and get away. Through that complex environment, what emerged was the importance of refugia. And in having a sufficiently complex environment, you're able to have this dynamic equilibrium. So it was only when we added complexity and sort of this spatial availability that we started actually being able to understand that equilibrium is not something that's easily come by. It's actually quite fragile. So the key key thing that I want you to take from this kind of crash course 101 of ecology is that if something is sufficiently diverse, in a complex environment and there are functioning corridors to provide refugia, then you get dynamic equilibrium. And that dynamic equilibrium is kind of like a spinning top. That's a stable, moving, living, breathing environment. The functioning corridors is an extremely important part. And I'm going to kind of hit on this throughout today's discussion. When we put up things like dams, that's a physical block that's breaking down that corridor. You're weakening the whole system without necessarily directly impacting any one biological organism of concern. You're taking away this key component to its stability. Another example, so you have a physical example like a dam. There could be chemical examples like Boss Mike showed earlier, really low pH. You can have metal loads, nutrients, all kinds of things can create these physical barriers that although the river is flowing, organisms are not able to come and go through that area. So complexity is really a function of abiotic variables, things like flow, geology, season, climate, as well as biotic variables, life histories of the organisms, the number of organisms. And all this starts leading to the last piece of ecology that I'll throw in, and then I'll get to talking about the North Branch. But it's an important concept, and this is the river continuum concept by Bonneau in 1980. So again, what I was talking about before with looking at that main highway and the side streets and then the suburb cul-de-sac, we see the same kind of thing happening with these networks in the Potomac River. We have our main stem, which is wider. It's getting more sunlight and it's kind of reducing in gradient, these wider sections. But as we move west into the basin, into these headwaters, the streams get smaller. They get more heavily shaded. We see the water temperatures decrease. And this is another predictable pattern, just like we saw with the other sort of foundational ecology pieces. If you manipulate any of these variables, this system is going to hem and haw and adapt to what's being input into it. So some of our most fragile systems, when we take away things like shade on a river, or we start manipulating groundwater, which is temperature refugia, this can change everything below that point and kind of augment this continuum. So I'm going to keep going, and we're going to jump into the geology of the North Branch. Pay attention, because if I do this right, all these things are going to stack back in at the end. So the geology of the North Branch, and I'm surprised at the number of folks that just aren't familiar with how the Appalachians even formed. So I want to just real quickly talk about, the continent as we see it now hasn't always been. A lot of folks know Pangea, but there were landforms before Pangea. Pangea was the product of three different orogenies. There's the Taconic, the Acadian, and the Allegheny orogeny. The Allegheny orogeny is the primary final collision that made the Appalachians, and these mountains were huge millions of years ago. But after the third collision, there was actually kind of a subsidence, and the Atlantic Ocean started opening up. And as that opened up, we had the coastal plain emerge, water levels dropped. And the most important thing to realize here is that these collisions were pushing up this ancient ocean floor. And with that, the stresses, the geological stresses that this area experienced really defines the base layer of what can live in this area. So today, the North Branch, can you guys see my mouse when I do something like this?
Yes.
Okay. So the North Branch is right here at the furthest western part of Maryland. You'll see that it's the Appalachian Plateau and the Valley and Ridge. The Appalachian Plateau is very flat-lying, kind of a gentle dipping rock layer. The rivers in this area are more dendritic, and it's because it is this kind of flatter gradient. And that's That's very different than the Valley and Ridge. From all these collisions, it has these parallel strikes that are going from uh, Georgia on up to New Jersey. You can see it if you go on Google Earth. You can see that there's this kind of southwest to northeast line, and it kind of bends going through Pennsylvania. But that Valley and Ridge is actually it goes to show that these land masses aren't just, we get this idea that rocks are this hard, immobile, permanent thing. But in reality, if you have a piece of paper on your desk right now and you hold two ends and you push them together, that's mountain building. And how these mountains form have to do with the angle and the faults and things like that. More than I can get into on just this one lecture. But what's really important here is to think about um, these folds and the immense amount of pressure that occurred in the valley and ridge, and the less the pressure that wasn't experienced in the Allegheny Plateau. What that does, and when we get into kind of looking at the North Branch a little closer in a moment, you'll realize that there's a divide going right down the middle of the North Branch, where one side of it is going to be producing coal. Coal does not do well under high pressure and heat that would have been during the mountain forming. So it's existing in this area that the geology is conducive to what eventually becomes a very economically valuable resource. And the other side has experienced these massive collisions, and I don't want to get too fired up on it, but it's like when you look at these areas, you realize that these massive mountains have had these just, they look so fragile when you look at, this is Sidling Hill here. And from the air, you see the valley and ridge, that there are all these synclines and folds. I mean, that's what's going on, is that in this area, we have to understand that they've, right down the middle of this river, there are two very different environments that kind of form the canvas that all the biology in this region will be built on. What's really fascinating is this upper part of the Potomac Basin, or the North Branch Potomac. Right here at Kaiser, you can draw almost a straight line to Cumberland, and everything that's going towards the West Virginia side is going to be on your valley and ridge. Dan's Mountain, for those that are familiar with it, is kind of the where you strike that line, and everything west is going to be that Appalachian Plateau. And for folks that know the area, Georges Creek, some of the tributaries up above where Jennings Randolph Reservoir is now, which is over in this area. I'm sorry, over in this area. This was all heavily mined. So our headwaters in this system experienced some of the harshest environmental degradation from mining. And then it went right into this valley and ridge area, because this is a confining corridor. The geology was basically sticking the things that were coming, the resources coming out of this area, they were going onto the river and they were floating down to Cumberland. There's a whole story I want to get to there, but it's really important to understand that there are these two very discrete geological, I guess, layers in this area. When you drive out there, you see them. So kind of moving from geology to early human settlement, there's evidence that indigenous populations have been in this area for a very long time. And what's really interesting about the Potomac is that the Potomac seems to always be in its own state of dynamic equilibrium in terms of which indigenous populations were in this area. There are the Susquehannocks coming down from Pennsylvania. There were Virginians, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name right now. But there were Southern tribes that were moving up into this area, and this has always been a trade corridor. What's really interesting is that there's the Barton site, that is an archaeological site that's along the North Branch here, that shows some of the earliest woodland indigenous populations. There are these circles that show kind of the fire rings and the development of that area. And as you move along, you see that different communities were establishing in this area. That's largely to do with, that the ridge and valley side, that limestone based geology has a lot of good groundwater. The biological diversity in this area, there was a good food source. It was a trade corridor, with the valley and ridge being terrestrial movement corridors. We're seeing the reason people set up in this area is because of its connectivity and its rich resources. We look at some of the early, so these are pollen cores, and we look at some of the changes over time in this area. And this, what's important to realize, we talk a lot about, we put priority on native species, but native species is, pick your target, pick your time frame, because we've seen from looking at pollen cores that through climate change and other stressors that the forest is actually changing its dominant vegetation type. So when we think about Western Maryland and we think about the old growth and things like that, a lot of times we focus on the oak and the chestnut, and we don't give enough thought to that is a environment that took a lot of time to get to. And then once that environment was there, think about the leaf litter falling, the organic layer on the forest floor, things like that. This soil and this long development had created a really precious resource out in this area. So right up until about 1700, we see that this is all old growth forest, despite the fact that there were populations living in this area. Now we look at early colonial settings, that deforestation is basically technology limited, but it really takes off when things like large scale burning are taking place. To kind of put that into context, there in some cases with large scale burning, 1,800 acres a day are being burned to clear for farmland, for easier access to the more valuable large hardwoods. And with that, it really takes off right around this 1760 period. So 1760 to 1920 is what I really want to focus on. And a lot of folks in this area want to focus on coal mining as what really did the damage to this area. And I would argue that really it was the logging and the deforestation in this area that was causing much longer reaching impacts, much more ecological damage than the coal mining. Coal mining didn't really establish as an economic driver until 1850. So you have to think that there was almost a century that this area was being heavily logged, and their logging practices were really, really destructive. And the last thing I want to point out is that in this region, we really didn't see monitoring start until 1910. So I can talk a lot about anecdotal notes and things like that, but the reality is we really didn't have a good idea of what was in this area until the early 1900s. So that's almost 200 years of environmental degradation that's happening on a large scale in some of our smallest, most fragile headwater streams. That's going to have implications in a little bit. Again, I'll get to that in a little bit. So for those of you that were paying attention, I guess partaking with the survey at the beginning of this, the river is a living thing, and the town of Luke was first settled somewhere around 1760, 1770, and two brothers, the Davis brothers, if you're familiar with the town of Davis, West Virginia, that's where it got its name from. They saw that the river was sufficient at the area around Western Port Luke, Piedmont, West Virginia. That's the Tri-Cities. They saw that there was enough water present to operate a sawmill and to get that lumber down to Cumberland. And Cumberland is a corridor for a huge amount of trade. So they built this sawmill, and with the sawmill came more and more a greater population. And what's really wild is that this island that was out in the Potomac at one point was Luke, West Virginia, and then through rain events and basically uh, sort of solidifying the township itself, it kind of just became part of Maryland. Pretty wild story, something to dig into. Um, but anyway, so the railroad around the 1880s. I'm sorry, getting off my point. Um, so we get into the late 1700s, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is competing with the C&O Canal. It's bringing a lot of new technology and a more efficient way to extract resources out of the region. And a lot of the offcuts in this region, smaller tracks are going to the half track, the smaller trains that are going up the river and um, getting these resources out of Luke, out of Barnum, out of the headwaters, the North Branch. So we start seeing, ironically, it's connectivity that allows for more efficient extraction of resources in this area. And I want to show you a couple pictures. This is what, wild and wonderful West Virginia, wild Western Maryland. This is what it looked like at one point. And these are massive skid lines where large trees were just scouring out paths, basically like a horse-drawn plow, just clearing out huge amounts of undergrowth. For those that are familiar, there's also another name for a brook trout, kind of in the south, is the hemlock trout. It had such a tight relationship with hemlocks and the overgrowth of the stream to keep the streams cold. When these these logging practices began, those hemlocks were ripped out, taken out, and sold to tanneries. So there are tanneries all through this area. But that was to get the burden out of the way so that these larger logs could be put into the river and floated downstream. Off to the right here, you can see the half track, the smaller trains that, because of the mountainous terrain, were running out through these areas to serve the larger railroads back in Cumberland. Again, this is during the Civil War, but look in the background. This is Kaiser, West Virginia. There are no trees on the mountains in this area. And if you look around, take a drive today, it feels like there's a forest there. And it's pretty remarkable when you realize that it wasn't always there. Here's another picture of Kaiser, West Virginia, and these are some of the mining towns. The poverty in some of the mining towns basically meant that, you were cooking food on found wood, and that these areas were stripped bare to, the dirt floor shack kind of story. Cumberland is an economic driver. It is a powerhouse. And at one point in history, it's competing with Baltimore, DC, and Annapolis in terms of money and economic value to the state. And you can see that there's an entire, the riverbanks have been developed. And you look in the background, the three things that were coming out of Cumberland, you had lumber, you had coal, and of all things, you had fruit trees as one of the major products in this area. So you're seeing that these mountainsides with this very old growth are being stripped for orchards. 1910, again, this is behind Piedmont. And what's important to point out here is that these trees were massive. I mean, really impressive, huge trees. And we don't have any good measurement, any good metrics on assessing this, other than what really comes down to bookkeepers selling and trading goods and some of the early frontiersmen's, like their diaries. And we look for these anecdotes to kind of give us context of what was out there in these environments, because we don't know. So one of my favorite quotes from the Blackwater Chronicles is this, they took from a single pool, some 60 trout as fast as they could bait their hooks, and satisfied with the taste of the stream, they assured the hopes of trout innumerable. And they went and found a good place to camp. And one of the things I see with that is, when you read these stories, there were a lot of trout. They weren't trophy trout. There was a high density of trout in these areas. There's some great stories of these guys trying to climb over logs to get to fishing streams, and rotten trees being 6, 8 foot in diameter and losing the fishermen into a rotting log. So you have to think about just the size of what was out there. Um, Another thing that we, kind of lose in looking at how modern distributions of wildlife and animals. White-tailed deer, we see them everywhere. They hit cars. Everybody curses them, and insurance companies just, yeah, they're a nuisance, right? But there was a time when there were 300,000 white-tailed deer estimated left in the United States, the eastern United States. Today, Maryland DNR estimates that there's 200 to 250,000 in Maryland alone. In 1934, the Shenandoah National Park, they had to release 13 white-tailed deer, and they've now reestablished an extirpated population. There's about 5,000 along that ridge, but it's just that to give context of why I even bring up deer is that these forests and these complex environments that would have sustained these animals that we see very abundant now were just gone. So this system across the board is crashing pretty rapidly around the mid 1800s. This was a pretty big event. 1924, a nor'easter hits and dumps 15 to 20 inches of snow on the North Branch region, left many roads blocked, high winds. But what ends up happening, it's not so much the snow, it's the heat wave that happened immediately after it. And, you had this, we're coming up on, I've seen some of the forecasts that it's going to get warm around Christmas. It's like, for there to be this big, heavy snowfall followed by this warmth, this is something that's happened a century ago, and it caused catastrophic damage in this area. Luke, Maryland, Piedmont, Cumberland, all these areas just got absolutely decimated. A quick tangent, and again, I wish I could give this presentation in person. If anybody knows what this symbol is, it's called the King's Broad Arrow. And the reason I bring up the King's Broad Arrow is because you have to realize that the coal that's coming from Western Maryland, the timber that's coming from Western Maryland, all these resources coming down railways, floating down the river since the start of since the American Revolution. This is an area that is economically viable, but it's also national security. I mean, these are the things that built the battleships. The Constellation that's sitting in Baltimore was built with hardware from Western Maryland. And that's a pretty wild thing to consider. So anyway, Cumberland, I can't emphasize enough how important this is as an economically viable area. It's got 6 railroads, the B&O, the Western Maryland, Pennsylvania, the Georges and Cumberland Railroad, the Westernport Electric Railway. There's a manufacturing base. I could read you the whole list, but it would use up the rest of my time. This area is a booming town. And the quote that is given in this area is like, this is the heart of commerce to the west. Everything comes through Cumberland. So when this flood hits, it causes Congress and politicians to recognize this area as a matter of national security, and they want to protect it. They want to make sure floods don't happen again. What's important to recognize here is the floods like that. That was one big flood, but they were frequent. There was always rainfall in this area, and that the soils that made up this, environment. I love this quote: soils that were slowly built by perhaps an inch every 600 years are quickly washed away into the North Branch streams. At certain times a year, this area is so loaded with sediment and waste that it's not fit for drinking water and cooking purposes. And then in 1917, 10% of West Virginia is actively burning. This is the state of the area surrounding the North Branch, I mean, it's close to scorched earth, and that sediment has to go somewhere. When you walk in Washington, D.C., that dirt, that sediment, it's not that DC was always a swamp. DC is built on the tributaries around it. I think that should be a pretty sobering realization for two reasons. The area that we're now talking about and taking this ecological interest in has undergone not 200 years of disturbance, it has undergone 200 years of active disturbance and lost 10, 11,000 years of topsoil and stability and complex biological communities. So the area that we're talking about today in terms of a recovery success story really needs to be put into context as to the area that we're working in. With that flooding, there's a term that was coined, we need to armor Western Maryland. So the armoring of the North Branch is when the North Branch is channelized. It's the banks are hardened with concrete and stone berms. This is Wills Creek that comes in Cumberland, and North Branch, the North Branch up above Jennings Randolph, up in Kitzmiller. I mean, there's when you learn about basic river morphology, a river shouldn't run straight more than 10 times its width. Take a second, think about it. And then when you look out at portions of the North Branch basin, there are so many artificially manipulated areas where the idea was get the water out fast and let downstream deal with it. The solution to pollution is dilution mindset. And it's a legacy that is still something to overcome in this area. Another tool that was used to combat this flood risk was the design and then eventual implementation of Jennings Randolph Lake and Dam and the Savage Reservoir Dam. The purpose of these dams was to reduce flood, improve water quality of the river downstream, provide water supply to municipalities and industries downstream, and then eventually to avoid the public opportunities for recreation. It's done a lot of good in terms of improving water quality. And the whole system has kind of adapted to these things being in the environment. But we have to recognize that they haven't been there in the grand scheme of things for a long time. And it's kind of, a double-sided sword here. It's something that is going to help precipitate out acid mine drainage and heavy metals and things like that into the reservoir. But it's also created a physical impasse, breaking apart connectivity in this area. And so from 1982 to 2019, we worked up some of these conceptual drawings where basically like zone 1 is everything above Jennings Randolph Reservoir, which is right here. Zone 2 is everything above the Savage Reservoir. These are now isolated systems. And a lot of zone 1 has still has acid mine issues, but there are lots of opportunities for localized refugia all through this zone. Zone 2, the upper Savage, those are reference sites. Those are some of the best streams in Maryland and in the Potomac in terms of cold water biology. You get below these reservoirs, and there's this zone 3. These are directly influenced by operations of the operation of the reservoir. And that is something that, how we treat those reservoirs, and we treat things like cold water storage and water quality and responding to things like acid mine drainage, this is an artificial system at this point. It's also known as a tailwater. And then we see this kind of gradient towards a warm water stream as we go downstream here to Black Oak. This is McCool and Kaiser down here. This main stem North Branch Potomac is directly influenced by the operation of these reservoirs. Two things to point out: Zone 4 and Zone 6 are tributaries to the North Branch. This is Georges Creek. It's worth looking up, and I believe it was 96. There was an acid mine blowout that basically sterilized the main stem of Georges Creek. It's recovering slowly, but that's the kind of, and down here, this is New Creek. which again is a very developed watershed. There's really not a lot of canopy cover over the stream anymore. These were cold water trout streams that have basically suffered pretty significant environmental anthropogenic stresses. Once you get
You've got about 5 more minutes left if we're going to have any time for Q&A at the end. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
Okay, I was looking. I thought I still had 10. I'll move quick. So anyway, the warm water section in the lower area. This is a physical barrier to cold water taxa in this area. So really, what we have are a bunch of clusters of isolated cold water streams that, through the operation of the reservoirs and improved water quality and land use, we could increase connectivity. But there's a lot of the artificialness of this area really has to be considered. So it's a deliberate choice what we do next. So as I said before, this is the Dead River. Boss Mike kind of went over this, so I'm going to kind of shoot through this real fast. But since 1990, we see that once lime dosers are installed, this area really starts doing well. The North Branch holds almost at one point or another every trophy cold water fish record in the state of Maryland. And it's because of the fish hatchery that was below Jennings Randolph. It's because the temperatures that are being released from the reservoirs are conducive to faster growth rates. The forage community is good. And then what happens in 2019 is the Luke paper mill. The last of that industry that I talked about was such a boom in this area, it collapses. And the thermal input that this paper mill was putting into the main stem is gone. And there's a scramble to take care of, or to monitor cold water after the shutdown of this paper mill. There's a very complex story there. I'd love to go into that. That's a whole nother lecture. But you can see how hot the water is compared to, that's a trout fishery with steaming water from those ports. Pretty wild. If we look at modern and historical distributions, again, these mussels, there's nothing in the North Branch. And we look at the West Virginia records as well. There's nothing in the North Branch. And it's because we didn't start looking until the 1910s to 1930s. So in terms of understanding recovery in this system, we don't know what our target is. So how can we increase the stability of this system without knowing what's there? Well, you work towards a future. And that's where, if you remember my last presentation from a couple weeks ago, increasing connectivity on dams 4 and 5 and the Cumberland Dam to get eel into this river, that is something that's going to be able to transport mussels into the North Branch. And we can just see if they can establish if the legacy of degradation in that area, if they can overcome that. But then there's going to be a discussion has to be had where the reservoir operators and what the vision, what do we want that tailwater to be? So it's interesting that we can improve the connectivity, build it and they will come kind of mentality. But are we creating a thermal barrier that's going to stop certain aspects of restoration goals in this area? I don't know. We see that mussels are coming back to the western part of the basin. A couple more things I want to highlight. Smallmouth bass are an invasive species. They've boomed and crashed twice now. The initial introduction put them in the North Branch, and then again in the 90s they were introduced, and it seems like they're disappearing from the North Branch currently. Rainbow trout and brown trout were introduced in the 1880s. Again, this is before records. People are out there looking at fish distributions. So we put such priority on brook trout now and their distributions, but in this area, we didn't have any concept as to where they occupied, because the piscivorous carnivores, the things that would keep them out of areas like the main stem North Branch, had already established. And there's some interesting work in Penn State that highlights that larger streams are critical for genetic diversity and connectivity of these fish. Right now, having them clustered into headwaters might not make sense, but we have to make a management decision as to what our end goal is. And that's where things like this, the shared vision documents, come into play. We're doing a lot of work right now. Most recently, this is in 2025, we worked with the Army Corps with their environmental flows workshop and report. And it just kind of comes down to what comes next. And what is the extent of the reservoirs? What do we want the tailwater to be? And this idea of connectivity, we can give the opportunity for things to establish here, but is it something that we can afford with water quality and quantity? Just a real quick run through. ICPRB is doing continuous temperature monitoring. So is Maryland Department of Environment, as well as Maryland DNR, to get enough data to build models out here. We've done some biological response to reservoir actions with telemetry. And what's really interesting with this is we're seeing the trout, for the most part, a lot of them went downstream, and where they clustered, it didn't make sense. They were clustering in the warm water zones. I go back to the geology we talked about earlier. They're not holding over in the plateau. They're down in the valley and ridge where there are potential karst cold water upwellings creating thermal refugia. So then this question becomes, is there built-in resiliency in this system? And do the reservoirs have to do all the work? Or is this system potentially stable enough if it's just enough help? And we're doing a lot of, we've done some LiDAR work, three-dimensional scans of almost the whole basin now, where we can look at things like habitat modeling and flow models. Just a lot of great work we can do. And this was in partnership with USGS. We're doing some modeling work with them in the future. I'm going to wrap it up. I think I kind of ran out of time, but the important thing closing this conversation out is the North Branch is truly unique in that, there are these core ecological concepts that could aid in its recovery. But because of the legacy of industry and the future of this area, I mean, Cumberland has the Western Maryland Economic Recovery Plan right now. It wants to be a big city again. And we have to, as a community, make a decision as to the fate of this river, something that's come such a long way from a dead river to a trophy trout stream. Where do we go next? I don't have an answer for you. I encourage anybody to have a conversation. We're going to pursue more the next updated, the Flowing to the Future document, to have this shared vision. And with that, I just kind of want to leave you with one of my favorite, Aldo Leopold quotes, which is trying to figure out what's good. We have to, as a community, agree on what is good. And I think it's what supports a community. And it's wrong if it harms it. So we have to come together, have a shared vision, and really take care of this just very unique and wonderful resource that is the western part, the North Branch Potomac River. With that, I think I've used all my time and then some. Any questions or anything?
Yes, thank you, Mike. That was a lot of great information. We do have some questions in the chat, but if you have to run off, I know we're at time, go ahead and log off, but we'll take a stab at your questions. So Jim Cummins did make a good note. If you want to read through that, I won't read through that. But
I can't read the notes right now, but
no, I meant for the attendees, not you.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, one question. One of the slides flashed the term dosers, which from other discussions I take are devices to counter the acidity of the water. Can you say a few words about what they are and the decision to put them in? That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, so the full term is the lime dosers, and there are different types of dosers. There are passive and active dosers, but they all kind of have the same ultimate purpose, and that's to take high pH water and run it through a basic and alkaline filter, basically, and then it comes out as a more neutral, buffered water that when it goes into the main stem, it's no longer deleterious to the aquatic organisms living in that stream. And I guess Oh, sorry. I was gonna say the decision to put them in is basically like, um, there's again, it's too long a story to tell, but there's some really interesting things about how these mines were designed and designed to passively get water out of these mines. So when there's a blowout, there's generally a pool of this very acidic water that it just from gravity it wants to get out of the mine. So you have to do something to actively interact with that mining spoil.
Thank you. And I just put a picture of a lime doser. They're not highly complex machines or destructive to the water. They're just very passive. And okay, so the next question is the rail spur from the North Branch to the Mount Storm power plant. Oh, is the rail spur from the North Branch to the Mount Storm power plant still in use? Does it supply coal to the plant?
Truth is, I don't know that one. I know I've recently had a couple conversations about kind of what's happening with Mount Storm and some of the upper tributaries, but most of ICPRB's work is focused on the reservoirs and the tailwater, the downstream section to Cumberland. But I know coal mining is still very active in the area. If you spend any time on the river, those trains are piled high.
Thank you. So Jim Cummins noted. Jim Cummins is a retired aquatic biologist at ICPRB. We arranged for the transfer of the dosers from Pennsylvania, where they had been used to treat acid precipitation from Midwestern power plants. But when the laws that funded those failed, the power plants were abandoning them. They worked great in the North Branch. The greatest thanks for their operation goes to the Maryland Bureau of Mines. So thank you for that input, Jim. Are there other questions? I did give you the power to unmute yourself or to turn on your camera if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question. Go ahead. If you are interested also in the presentation on American eels that Mike Selkman gave earlier this month, that is also on our YouTube page. So you can just Google ICPRB YouTube and you can find the recording there. It's interesting. It's about American eels in the region and especially in the North Branch area. I don't see any other questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The last thing I'll say is that an hour to put all of this into context is an absolute sprint. There are so many more things like that we could go into with the role of like wind turbines and the energy sector shift, the economic recovery of Cumberland and some of the Blue Ridge Dam plans. There's a lot going on out here and there's a lot of opportunity. And that's why I really encourage everyone who's interested to seek out more information. I'm always happy to answer emails. And yeah, I mean, it's such a gem of a part of the Potomac. I highly suggest getting out there and getting on the water.
Agreed. All right. Thank you, Serena. Just put a link to our eel webinar in the chat. So if we don't have any more questions, thank you very much for joining us. This is our final webinar of our 85th anniversary webinar series. We hope you enjoyed them. We really did. I learned a lot. So with that, I will wrap it up. Everyone have a great holiday season.